Yeah.
Shall we begin?
Yes, I begin.
Okay.
I will talk, introduce you. So after that, you present remark to honor ambassador.
The ambassador.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now we start.
Yep.
Dear everyone, today we are very honored to organize the AIWS ceremony to honor Ambassador Stavros Lambrinis, EU ambassador to the US, and also have a panel discussion about AI International Accord. Every year in April, later April, Boston Global Forum, Michael Dukakis Institute organized special event about AI society. And in this event, we honor world leader in AIWS and announce and discuss new initiative and meaningful initiative. And this year we do AI International Accord Roundtable. This is a United Nations Centennial Roundtable event of United Nations Centennial as an initiative of Boston Global Forum and United Nations Academic Impact. And today we are honor Ambassador Stavros Lambrinis as world leader in AI world society. And this morning we have very good news. We have very good news. One artist from Vietnam have just sent and finished special painting to congratulate and honor Ambassador Stavros Lambrinis, the United Nations Centennial as the age of global enlightenment painting. And now we are give to Governor Michael Dukakis. Governor Michael Dukakis, chairman, co-founder of Boston Global Forum. And he's very well known as a great achievement in politics and government already. I don't want to say more, but exciting. Today we will discuss in panel AI International Accord. This is a call from Governor Michael Dukakis in 2018. He called that the world need an international accord on AI. And today we will announce and discuss the first version of AI International Accord. Thank you so much for your joining us. Thank you so much and grateful for your contribution. And all of us today, Joy, we are so highly appreciate your contribution. And now we would like to introduce Governor Michael Dukakis, chairman, co-founder of Boston Global Forum, and Michael Dukakis Institute, co-founder of AI World Society. Thank you. Dear Governor.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you all. I'm in a slightly darkened room in my home, so I hope I can do justice by my notes here, but I'm particularly pleased and honored to be able to make this presentation to a fellow Greek and somebody who does us proud. And so with your permission, I want to read this introduction and then introduce the ambassador for, I hope, a few words and comments on what we're doing here. As all of you know, I'm a strong internationalist and very concerned about the kind of tensions and situation that seems to be developing internationally. And I hope one of the things we can do with the Boston Global Forum and with this process is to see if we can't get our friends around the world, including ourselves, to get serious about the settlement of disputes peacefully and effectively. I lived through the Cold War, as many of you did. I don't think we need another one. So I hope we can make real progress. In any event, let me just say a few words about the ambassador. Ask him to speak to us. Bring our wonderful consul general here in Boston, Stratos Efthimiou, in to say a few words, and then Tuan will go to work on the topic of the day. And I hope by the time this is over, we have some broad consensus about how we can make and perform a really constructive role in all of this. In any event, here we are. I'm pleased to announce that this year's recipient of the Boston Global Forum's World Leader in AI World Society is Stavros Lambrinidis. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Oh,
Lambrinidis. Okay.
it's the best pronunciation I've ever had, ever.
Τα ελληνικά μου είναι πολύ απλά. Και δεν έχω λεξιλόγιο των πολιτικών καθόλου. So I can't do the high politics in Greek, but I learned my yaya, which in Greek is learned my Greek from my yaya when I was a little kid. So I speak kind of seven-year-old Greek, but not so badly, and very proud, obviously, of my Greek heritage and background and so forth. The ambassador was born in Athens, educated in the United States at Amherst College. He tells me he started at the University of Chicago and decided he wanted to come to New England for the rest of his undergraduate. And by the way, Amherst College also educated 2 Greek prime ministers, interestingly enough. The current prime minister didn't go to Amherst. He decided he was going to be the #1 student in his class at Harvard, and he was. But we still like him. He's a good guy. But interesting that Amherst was where our honoree spent most of his undergraduate years before he went off to Yale Law School, and then went off to a great career in public service. His entry into public life also took place here when his law firm, he was practicing law at that time in Washington. His law firm advised the White House during the Carter and Clinton administration. And it was during that period that he then served as president of the Commission for Human Rights for the District of Columbia Bar. He returned to Greece in 1994, serving as a special advisor to George Papandreou, who would later become Greece's prime minister. He served in several posts before being elected to the European Parliament in 2004, the first of 2 such elections. 5 years later, he was chosen vice president of the European Parliament and then became the EU's Minister of Foreign Affairs, which was followed in 2011 by his appointment as Greece's foreign minister. He then served as the European Union's first special representative for human rights before becoming the EU ambassador to the United States, a position he now holds. Throughout his career, he's been a tireless advocate of human rights, economic development, and equality, and European and international cooperation. I want to emphasize that. International cooperation, something we need badly these days. For more than a decade, he has been a leading voice on data privacy issues, transatlantic collaboration, on the digital economy, and enlightened application of artificial intelligence. In that context, he has said, as the development and deployment of artificial intelligence advances, my hope is that Europe and the United States will work more closely together, continuously and at all levels, to guide our technological progress in a way that is consistent with our shared values. Together with like-minded partners around the world, we must ensure that AI enhances the human condition and experience for all mankind. Without trust, without keeping humanity at the center of our technological advancements, our progress in an increasingly technologically dependent. Increasingly technological dependent society will not be sustainable. Those are very important words, folks, and I hope they will guide our our discussion this morning, because they are so important. Again, it's my deep honor and pleasure to recognize Stavros as this year's recipient of the Boston Global Forum's World Leadership in AI World Society Award. And I say that with great affection as a fellow Greek. Greeks are almost unbearable when it comes to this kind of thing. We're very close, and we're very proud of our background, our heritage. And when somebody comes along with his background and his qualifications and his leadership, we're extra proud. So, Stavros, welcome, congratulations, and
thank you. Well,
join us.
Thank you, dear Governor Dukakis, dear Tuan, Mark Rottenberg, a very good friend, distinguished members of the Artificial Intelligence World Society Committee, the Boston Global Forum, dear friends. Thank you for this distinction, which I accept with gratitude and humility. I am especially moved to receive it, as you can imagine, from Governor Dukakis, who not only epitomizes public service and leadership in this country, but has also been a source of great pride in his ancestral one. Σας ευχαριστώ για την μεγάλη τιμή που μου κάνετε. Thank you for this high honor. Now, ambassadors, as is well known, are asked to speak about many topics for which they are not experts, to say the least. But in fact, artificial intelligence and human rights in the digital age are two topics that I have followed closely for a very long time. They are a large portion of my current work as European Union ambassador to the United States. And long before that, I followed these issues closely as a Greek politician and member of the European Parliament. Now, while Vice President of the European Parliament's Civil Liberties Committee, I wrote the very first report on security and privacy in the digital age exactly 11 years ago, when the topic was hardly as hot as it is today. Now, I believe, and I think Mike Dukakis will understand this, that my personal experience of growing up under a dictatorship in Greece endowed me with an acute awareness of the fragility of our open and free societies. Even as a child, I saw firsthand that even strong democracies can fall under authoritarian spells. I remember the dictatorship holding files on different citizens, including my parents, with personal information revealing their political activities and preferences to be used against them, or to scare them, frankly, into silence. Perhaps this explains best why, when I look at the promise, but also at the challenges posed by digital technologies, I've always been guided by two fundamental principles in politics and now in diplomacy. First, in real democracies, it is the people who should have the power to judge the thoughts and actions of the governments every day, and to hold companies to account every day, not governments or companies who are supposed to observe or judge the daily actions or thoughts of their citizens. If the unrestrained use of technology leads to the latter instead of the former, we have flipped democracy on its head. Second, in today's democracies, a big brother will materialize slowly and by stealth, not suddenly in the form of an authoritarian figure who takes away our rights in one fell swoop. If it happens, it will be gradual, by 1,000 cuts, with our own explicit or tacit consent, with our complacency. Now, since the early 2000s, an example that illustrated that conundrum was the unfolding mass use of cameras in the streets. What should be their proper use? For regulating traffic? Sounds reasonable. Protecting us from terrorist attacks? Absolutely. But given that by their very nature, they could be used on a 24-hour basis for many more things, identifying perhaps all participants at a protest in case just a few of them turned violent, catching a pickpocket in addition to a terrorist. Well, you see, the question then quickly became, where do democracies draw the line for the use of technology to avoid dangerous slippery slopes? What is necessary, appropriate, proportionate usage? Who should have access to the data and who should not? Where should such personal data be stored in order to be kept safe? And when should it be permanently deleted? Now, you will notice many of these questions, bring yawns to many people. They think that they're too technical. But in fact, it is in that detail that lies the heart of democracy and human rights when it comes to the digital age. And of course, soon thereafter, similar questions started to be raised on the collection and use of citizens' personal data by major private companies and digital platforms. Now, the argument used by some governments and business at the time, the one that most troubled me, was, quote, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, unquote. Some of you may remember this. It troubled me because it, in essence, encouraged the innocent to offer the consent to their very own unfettered surveillance in the name of catching the few guilty. If successful, it could indeed lead to the gradual and irreversible salami slicing of our rights with our consent. So what I would often answer to the posed pseudo dilemma above is, well, you know, if you have nothing to hide, you don't have a life. Get a life. Indeed, we have all thousands elements of our private interactions, relationships, histories, beliefs that we do not want others to be able to have, immediate and unfettered access to. Okay, now that was then. The reality today is that we are all thinking about technology, innovation, and privacy quite differently than we did a few years back. We've seen and are seeing more every day that citizens want baseline privacy protections, that the status quo isn't good enough, and that the time is ripe for new actions to improve citizens' rights and trust in technology. In Europe, we have always been forward-leaning when it comes to the protection of privacy, perhaps for historic reasons. Look at the Greek dictatorship. And withstood, frankly, significant criticism for pioneering it in the beginning, not least of all with the General Data Protection Regulation, you may remember. Now, without a doubt, we are a better and stronger union today for the privacy safeguards that we have in place. And we are now committed to seeing that our privacy protection also safeguards innovation and competition, because our economies and our societies, frankly, need both. Now, whether you call it artificial intelligence or machine learning, or both in the broader sense, they represent change. And change makes many of us uncomfortable because it creates a new reality, something different from what we have come to know. It is easy, frankly, to fear the unknown. I will not lecture you on the textile revolution or the industrial revolution or the introduction of the automobile. They represented massive shifts in our technological progress, and the economic benefits as well as the social upheaval that accompanied them well documented. Artificial intelligence is different, however, more complex and far-reaching. In creating a tool that can make judgments that can decide for us between multiple alternatives, we have introduced a new form of change in our daily lives. It is, if you like, a change to the nth power, scaling exponentially in a way that we have not yet experienced. Now, as policymakers, citizens, and consumers, even as ordinary human beings, we must ask ourselves, who do we want to make the rules for tools that are becoming increasingly embedded invisibly in the fabric of our society? How do we ensure that artificial intelligence embedded in the cars we drive, the energy we consume, the health services we receive, the messages we send, the news we read, even in the refrigerators that we use, is safe, controllable, unbiased, and trustworthy? That AI does not discriminate, is not used to observe and judge, to socially score, or to infringe on our human rights. In the final analysis, how do we ensure that AI technologies enhance and protect our freedoms, our well-being, our democracies, our humanity, rather than diminish them? In Europe, we believe that there is a clear interrelation between innovation and fundamental rights, that one can promote the other. We value, we champion, and we thrive from innovation. Last year, as the deadly COVID-19 pandemic spread rapidly across the globe, AI demonstrated its potential to aid humanity by helping to predict the geographical spread of the disease, diagnose the infection through computed tomography scans, and frankly, develop the first vaccines and drugs against the virus that we have today. And European companies and innovators have been at the forefront of every aspect of that effort. The winner of last year's Future Unicorn Award, presented annually by the European Union to startups with the greatest potential, was awarded to a Danish company, Corti, which uses AI and voice recognition to help doctors predict heart attacks. So clearly, the possibilities and opportunities for AI are immense, from turning on wind turbines to produce the clean energy for our green transition, to detecting cyber attacks faster than any human being, or cancer in mammograms earlier and more reliably, perhaps, than trained doctors. And we hope that AI will even help us to detect the next infectious outbreak before it becomes a deadly pandemic. We want AI to do all these great things. At the same time, just as in every technological evolution that has come before it, we must prepare for the unexpected. With the increasing adoption of AI, our rights to privacy, dignity, freedom, equality, and justice are all at stake. These are fundamental to our lives as Europeans and enshrined in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. So it is our aspiration, Governor, to create machines that are able to do more and more of our own thinking, selections, and decision-making. And if that's our aspiration, we must also take care to ensure that those machines do not make the same mistakes that we humans have been prone to make. One example, the use of facial, voice, and movement recognition systems in public places. Well, they can help make our lives much more secure. However, they can also allow governments to engage in mass surveillance, social scoring, intimidation, and repression, as China has shown in the most cynical and calculated way in Xinjiang. You want another example? The use of AI in recruitment decisions. It can be very helpful. However, if a computer compares resumes of senior managers and concludes that being male is a good predictor of success, the data simply reflects bias, a bias within our society, which historically has favored men for leadership positions. We do not want AI to reinforce existing biases by copying and infinitely replicating them. Now, these are just two examples that, to me at least, illustrate why we must not become bystanders to the development and deployment of AI. If we, the major world democracies, do not move to establish a regulatory framework to protect our rights, I dread to think who will. In Europe, we have been thinking about these questions for many years now. We see that technology is an inescapable, necessary, and desirable part of our future, but without trust in it, our progress as a society will simply not be sustainable. Now, wearing both my ambassador of the European Union and European citizen hats, I'm immensely proud that the European Commission has just presented a groundbreaking proposal for a regulatory framework on artificial intelligence. It is the first proposal of its kind in the world, and it builds on years of work, analysis, and consultation with citizens, academics, social partners, NGOs, businesses, including US businesses, and of course, EU member states. It is not a regulation for regulation's sake. I really want to underline this. It responds to calls for a comprehensive approach across the European Union to protect basic rights, encourage innovation consistent with our values, provide legal certainty to innovative companies, spur technological leadership, and prevent the fragmentation of our European single market. In terms of scope, the draft regulation is actually quite limited. It will introduce a simple classification system with 4 levels of risk: unacceptable, high, limited, and minimal. Unacceptable, and that's prohibited AI practices, are those which deploy subliminal techniques beyond the human's consciousness, such as toys or equipment using voice assistants that could lead to dangerous behavior, or the exploitation of vulnerabilities of specific groups of persons due to their age, physical or mental disability. And of course, we outlaw the social scoring that we see AI being used for in some authoritarian countries, including China. Real-time remote biometric identification systems used in public spaces are also classified as an acceptable risk, with extremely narrow exceptions when strictly necessary. Now, when enacted, the regulation will set binding requirements for a small fraction of so-called high-risk uses of AI, the second category of risk, like credit scoring, sorting software for recruitment, verification of travel documents, robot-assisted surgery, the management of critical infrastructure, such as electricity, or when an AI assists a judiciary authority, just to name a few practical examples. Now, the binding requirements ensure that in such cases, high-quality data sets are used, risks are adequately managed, documentation and logs are kept, and human oversight is provided for in order to ensure that AI systems are robust, secure, and accurate. In the end of the day, dear friends, the purpose of the regulation is twofold. First of all, to ensure that Europeans can trust what AI has to offer and embrace AI-based solutions with confidence that they are safe. And secondly, to encourage innovation to develop in an ecosystem of trust. As Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Margrethe Vestager put it recently, trust is a must, not a nice to have when it comes to AI. Now, as was the case with the General Data Protection Regulation, the Commission's AI proposal will be subject to legislative scrutiny before it can become law in all EU countries. And without a doubt, it will also be a topic of some debate here in the United States as well. And the European Union looks forward to these discussions with our like-minded partners. The governor at the beginning mentioned the importance of international cooperation. And this is precisely the emphasis that we're placing as European Union. And this is because, frankly, on the global stage, AI has become an area of strategic importance at the crossroads of geopolitics and security. Having taken this pioneering step with the regulation, the EU will work to deepen partnerships, coalitions, and alliances with third countries and with like-minded partners, such as the Michael Dukakis Institute and many others here in this room today, to promote trustworthy, ethical AI. Exploring a social contract for the AI age, a framework to ensure an AI Bill of Rights in the digital age is fundamental in international relations today. And in this work, our relationship with the United States is paramount. For Europe, the United States, indeed, for all democracies around the world, our shared values make us natural partners in the face of rival systems of digital governance, and together we must rise to the occasion. Now, this is why European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called for a transatlantic agreement on AI that protects human dignity, individual rights, and democratic principles that can serve as a blueprint for our engagement with the rest of the world and like-minded countries. My hope is that Europe and the US will work more closely together, continuously and at all levels, with engineers, policymakers, thought leaders, civil society, scientists, businesses on both sides of the Atlantic to guide our technological progress and to help us improve, evolve, and become more just, equitable, and free societies. And I hope that all AI students and researchers, innovators, policymakers, business leaders, and others listening to us today will turn this aspiration into a new reality. Dear Governor, dear friends, we have a window of opportunity to act, and we should do so now. During my time as EU ambassador to the United States, I will do all in my power to bring it about. And once again, please accept my warm gratitude and appreciation for this award. It is a deep, deep honor for me, and I look forward to working with you to make this happen. Thank you.
Well said, well said. Well, we're delighted to honor you, and those are words that we should take very seriously, folks. I agree with the ambassador. We don't have a lot of time to fool around here. We've got work to do, and the sooner the better. So thanks so much, and thanks for being a part of this, and we look forward to working with you. And we have a special guest for some brief comments who happens to be our terrific Consul General here in Boston, who wants to welcome you officially as the Greek Consul General. Stratos, there you are. Stratos Efthymiou. And I say this to Stratos all the time. I'll never forget his last name, because the first priest that we had when I was a kid at the Greek Cathedral here in Boston was Father Efthymiou. Not related, but way back maybe they were. Anyway, great to have you with us for a few words of welcome to the ambassador.
We will send flag of honor to ambassador here.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor Dukakis, and dear Tuan, for the invitation. I always remember the stimulating discussion we hosted last year at the consulate, which is always at your disposal to host events when we get back to our normal lives. I want to praise the AI World Society for honoring Ambassador Lambrinidis. I have to say that I'm proud, both as a Greek and as a European diplomat, of the ambassador's leadership as head of the EU's most important foreign delegation. Stavros Lambrinidis is a person whom I admire. He is the symbol of a hardworking and meritocratic Greece that thrives internationally. Like Governor Dukakis' public service, the Ambassador Lambrinidis' diplomatic and political career highlights, in my opinion, the moral dimension of politics, and sets an example of how public service should be. I remember back in 2004 how fervently he spearheaded the international efforts for the Athens 2004 Olympic Truce Initiative, and how, as a European MP, he defended the European citizens' values and freedoms. As a foreign minister, he was a sober voice, representing Greece with dignity during the most challenging time of modern Greek history. I recall when I was posted in Russia in 2012, when he visited Moscow as the EU's special representative for human rights, having very frank and straightforward discussions with the Russian officials on human rights. So I would say that the defense of the European values of openness, democracy, and freedom has been the moral thread that has united his public service. And in Washington, Ambassador Lambrinidis managed to keep all the doors open in challenging times. And now he's building new bridges with the Biden administration in the fields of trade, foreign policy, climate change, increasing the EU's visibility and bringing with his public diplomacy and art initiatives a breath of fresh air in the diplomatic circles of DC. Now beyond,
right there.
Yeah, this is a wonderful initiative, bringing art to the embassy.
From the Baltimore American Visionary Art Museum, and it's absolutely fantastic art. I use the residents to exhibit U.S. art, frankly. I mean, usually ambassadors exhibit the art of their own countries, but I represent 27 countries. That was not possible for me to do very easily. So I have U.S. art because I want to celebrate the reasons Europeans love this country, not just tell Americans why they should love us, which is obvious part of my job.
And you know, I remember these paintings. Yeah, this is a great initiative. And beyond the issues I mentioned above, AI is an enormous global challenge and a field, as you mentioned, Ambassador, such as the GDPR and climate change, where the EU can be a global normative power, shaping the international rules and agenda. A global EU role that Greece fully supports. And obviously this transatlantic cooperation will define the progress of the international efforts to regulate digital technology and AI. And I think that from this prism, also the ambassador's role is crucial. Ambassador, congratulations for this award, which is also an indirect recognition of the EU's critical role in the international regulation of AI and its moral implications, which you very well described. Congratulations.
Thanks. Thanks to you both. It's an honor and a source of great pride for us Greek Americans to be able to work with you. And we thank you so much and congratulations again. Okay, now we begin our discussion. And Tuan, make sure I'm
we are
sticking to schedule. But
yes, because Ambassador Raghavan will have to leave soon, so please invite him. Talk first.
Shall we begin with the ambassador?
Yeah, Ambassador India. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Do I see him? Are you with us?
Yes, Raghavan. Please.
In any event, Mr. Raghavan.
Yes, thank you.
There you are.
Governor.
Okay, thank you. Welcome again. Good to see you.
Thank you very much. I thought I would follow Professor Chowkri and her presentation of the Draft International Accord. But I'm very sorry that I have to actually leave for another engagement.
It's okay.
But let me start by saying it's a very great pleasure and an honor for me to be with you today, with you, Governor Dukakis, once again. And it's an honor to listen to Ambassador Lambrinidis today. Coming from India, I would like to first respond with great feeling to Governor Dukakis, your view that we do not want a Cold War again. And anything that the world can do to prevent one, if not two Cold Wars would be most welcome. I also, what Ambassador Lambrinidis said about the ethical questions, about the delicate balance between privacy, human rights, law enforcement, security. Frankly, I mean, any technology brings these dilemmas to the fore, and AI brings it to the fore, I think, much more strongly than others because of its enormous capacity to both help progress and to harm it. Basically, we are discussing today, I think, the draft framework for an international accord on artificial intelligence, which Professor Chowkri has drafted a framework which I think is going to be discussed today. And I would like to really compliment her on an excellent, comprehensive paper, which captures the intricacies of the issues and also the breadth of the challenges. I think it's a perfectly valid point. Ambassador Lambrinidis also actually referred to it in one way, that transformations of artificial intelligence innovations and its applications move far ahead of our collective ability to fully appreciate both the opportunities and the threats from them. And therefore, while countries are really groping in many ways to develop their own AI policies at different levels of sophistication, there has been little realization of the importance of an international regime that promotes cooperation in moving it in a direction for human progress and mitigating the destructive potential. Professor Chowkri will, of course, be presenting the draft framework. And I, having seen it, I'm fully in agreement with the deliverables that she has identified in the draft framework, which I think merits wide discussion, and developing a methodology of approach, a collective methodology of approach to them. A few comments I have on such an international accord, also touching a bit on what Ambassador Lambrinidis said. I think it is very important that such an accord should be inclusive. This is because, unlike most other economic agreements, international agreements, where signatories can ensure that they abide by their provisions without reference to the activities or the actions of non-signatories, the borderless nature of AI tools means that those excluded from a multilateral compact would have no incentive not to use them to the detriment of others. And therefore, I think it is extremely important to have as many countries as possible inside the tent in order to be able to sustain a vibrant, a robust international accord on artificial intelligence. And that means, I was there at the last discussion that we had in the Boston Global Forum, where we talked about artificial social contract and particularly binding democracies. Ambassador Lambrinidis also mentioned this, the democracies as particular drivers of such an accord. The problem is that today there are far too many models, so-called models of democracy, and far too many variations even within these so-called models of democracy. I think that the important criterion in any international accord should be the willingness of a country, the willingness of a society, the willingness of a group to abide by agreed norms, not necessarily the system of governance that they adhere to. I think we need not be, our search for an agreement on an AI accord need not be influenced by judgments on the quality of democracy of a society wanting to join it. I have to give an example. I mean, you take Vietnam, for example. Vietnam would not be described as a democracy, and yet it is a disciplined member of the international community, abiding by international law. So if Vietnam is willing to abide by the discipline of an international accord, there is no reason to exclude it on the basis that it's not a democracy. I think this would be counterproductive for the kind of international regime that we seek to establish. Building on that is also this question of, as I said, the balance between the ethical balance between human rights, privacy, law enforcement, and security. Now, this varies in different societies depending on their geographical circumstances, on the political circumstances, on their surroundings, and on the social. So I think we need to be. I'm not justifying the kind of actions that the ambassador described that China is engaged in. But what I'm saying is that we cannot really evolve a universal standard of such behavior. So the what the draft actually does, which I have seen, is that it leaves national authorities free to frame, within limits certainly, their own practices, reconciling these various conflicting objectives, but binding countries to an international discipline on this. Another point was, again, in the accord, the draft accord talks about sanctioning violations of such of the accord, and I think in a subsequent correspondence with Professor Chaudhry, we discussed that perhaps better than sanctions would be an incentive regime. We have seen sanctions in recent years being applied not only against adversaries but also against allies and partners, and primary and secondary sanctions. For one thing, they've spoiled the atmosphere, and for another, they have not achieved their purpose. So perhaps we should be looking at an incentive regime rather than a prescriptive forcing regime. I think the other point we need to keep in mind is the point of, again, Professor Chaudhry makes that point, of variance in AI capability around the world. And this reminds us of the digital divide, which actually divided societies and created strife. And I think we need to make sure that there is adequate capacity building regime to bring countries up to speed with their capacity to exploit the progress elements of artificial intelligence, as much as to also create the capacity to enforce any kind of regime that an international accord would establish. So these are some of the thoughts that I wanted to mention. Of course, India has been, as many of you would know, a founding member of the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, which seeks to promote responsible use of AI, promoting human rights, inclusion, diversity, innovation, and of course, economic growth, while also trying to promote expertise in research and development to support cutting-edge research in AI. So, to conclude, I think what we should, it's extremely important to see how we can promote responsible use of this powerful resource and keep out malevolent forces disrupting it. And it's very important in this respect that we talked about a political Cold War, but there is also this technological Cold War brewing. Again, mention was made of this. It is very important that we try to avoid a technological Cold War and promote a shared and responsible international approach to the use of AI. This cannot be done without a background of the major powers of the world entering a modicum of cooperation rather than conflict, or not quite conflict, but tension at least. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I know you have to go on to other things, but it's a pleasure once again to have you with us and to listen to your wise advice, and we hope that will continue for some time. So thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Great, terrific. Okay, Nazli, where are you? There you are.
Well,
You're on. You're on.
This has been a really very, very interesting and very rich 50 minutes or whatever we have done. And I must say, I greatly appreciate what has been said so far. But I also would like to say that just before this discussion, Ambassador Raghavan and I had an email exchange, and I do support his rephrasing or all changes in the text that I have proposed. I have proposed on behalf of the Boston Global Forum and the Michael Dukakis Institute. There are two points I'd like to make before we get straight to the framework. The first is that almost everybody agrees about the salience of AI, but I don't think we appreciate how deeply it has already penetrated all of our societies in all sectors everywhere. And this is simply a footnote to what the speakers have said so far. My second point, and then we'll get to the framework, is we are the in-between generation. We're the only generation that got into the AI, understands the dilemmas, and as we move on, it's our responsibility to leave some kind of regulatory framework before the younger generation that has not had the Cold War experience, the World War I, World War II, et cetera, experience. If we can just organize for them a framing of action and a framing of discourse, it would be a major contribution that could be considered, our generation's contribution. Footnote here, I think that the Boston Global Forum and the Michael Dukakis Institute did not intend to exclude the non-democracies. I think we reinforce the democracies a tad bit, or lots of tads, too much. But the intent is somebody's got to stop this going, especially that the Europeans have given us many important anchors, one of which has not been brought up today, that I'd like to mention, which is the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. Imagine if there were a competition on the best use of AI by criminals, and then we honor the criminals. I'm not taking that seriously. I'm just saying that we have already in place foundational material, in addition to what has been said so far, that we should utilize. So onto the framework. We look at it. We've developed it into four components. The first has to do with the preamble, which reflects the premises or the assumptions, and those have been mentioned today. The second is the design of the framework. What does the architecture look like? Measures. The third is measures that really we should take, and those have to be discussed, altered, changed, etc. And then a support system needed in the course of articulating, developing, and moving from framework to something like a global regulatory framework. I think there's nothing that I have to tell you or can tell you that you don't know, but we may organize it a little bit differently. So on the preamble, which is the premises, how we get into this, we begin by recognizing, of course, the acceleration of AI penetration in societies. And we begin with the importance of recognizing the power of the precautionary principle that the international community has already agreed to. And it's one of the contributions in the climate change debates. Related to this on assumptions, of course, commitments to human rights are essential. We take that for granted. But at the same time, we have to highlight the domain of responsibilities. Rights and responsibilities more or less come together. Maybe the responsibilities are more institutional or national, but are still a responsibility issue. And then, of course, the added premise or value or assumption has to do with recognizing the diversity in the international community. It's a very banal statement to say we are a very diverse international community. Regretfully, it's essential to keep that in mind. So now let me move to the basic architecture, a framework design, if you wish. And because it's a framework, its elements can be altered. And because it's a framework, the details of the elements, such as they are now, can also be improved. Basic design is multi-stakeholder, balance of influence and responsibility across all participants, and respecting national authority and international commitments. This is just a repeat of what has been said so far, but perhaps in a less elegantly than what we've said so far. So there's some tasks are required, some things we have to do to consolidate our discussion into a viable draft framework. I'll just mention one or two. I won't go through the list, all of the list. And that is pulling together the legal frameworks in countries that address the AI issues. Many countries do so indirectly by putting it under some other technological category. And another essential task required for consolidating the draft is to be explicit about the norms, reinforce the norms, and as had been said by our speakers earlier today, articulate the introduction of new norms that are essential to support the regulatory framework. Ambassador Raghavan justly noted the use that I did in talking about constructing a sanctions system. Of course, incentive system would be much, much better. Withdrawing incentives could be a little bit painful. So we keep that in mind. Now, on the things that have to happen, the next element, which is the measures to be taken. We talk about starting with the individuals, we talk about individual rights, individual responsibilities with respect to what? Question mark. And here the framework suggests that included in the rights and the responsibilities is rights to digital and rights to AI-related education. The younger generation in place at the moment already has basic foundations that our generation didn't have when we got into the digital areas. And the right to avoid digital damages, a right. And then that comes responsibilities, which you can imagine what they're like. We've articulated them, but it's a question of how pragmatic we can be. Moving on to the measures to be taken for national policy at the national level, because ultimately we do want governments to be encouraged or willing to adopt a certain set of provisions and operate on them. One example is to provide education for all citizens or all individuals in their jurisdictions through real or online with advanced AI technologies. Every country has an educational system, of course, but not every country targets itself to do some technology leapfrogging, which is quite possible now, given the tools that we have. Another national imperative for national policy, and this one is very, very dicey, and I think we are open to framing it in any way we think is better, to protect intellectual property rights. Now, I'm really sorry to have to raise this. This is one of the elements that are difficult to finesse worldwide. Now, let me move on to measures to be taken among states, good, bad, or indifferent states, democratic or otherwise. Part of the dilemma is how to get everybody onto the same, roughly the same wavelength for discussions. And one strong type of action to be taken, measure to be taken, is to develop common principles to combat or contain, restrain misinformation. I recognize the dilemmas there, uh, but it's impossible to keep, or it's difficult to keep management of misinformation or the role of misinformation outside this discussion. And then we ask of the United Nations and international organizations, of course, their support system, and of course, leadership in developing, formalizing a global digital ethics. There are bits and pieces all over the place, as you have mentioned, but what has to be done is to be kind of create a holistic ethics design out of what we now have, some of which have been already mentioned. Moving on to the business entities, there are quite a few things that we would like them to consider, or that we expect of them. Again, a little dicey. To, for example, to enable audits for transparency, to really respect transparency when it comes to potential application of AI with damaging correlates. And to participate enthusiastically in the adoption of common AI standards across the board. And then finally, when it comes to what else would we like as measures, these are all measures, part of the framework, from civil society. Civil society is always put at the very end of any list. But civil society really is the ultimate arbiter as to whether something will work or will not work. And we expect civil society to be involved in the process by making its own requirements known and by supporting institutional mechanisms to accelerate involvement of younger people into the types of debates that we are having. So this ends the measures to be taken in general. The details of the framework are embedded in what I've articulated so far, the details as much as we have gone through. But what I'd like to conclude with is, when all is said and done, there are a set of we have to think about a support system to support the process that we are going through now. We're just talking about the beginning of a framework, a global framework, but we need a support system to help us through this. And the proposal here is to keep in mind the anchor, which would be the precautionary principle, but in terms of specific elements of a support system to keep us working through this, a code of ethics. The sooner we can get to the code of ethics, the better. We also suggest the establishment of a multidisciplinary international scientific community, commission that acts autonomous to provide independent review of where we are at, where we are going, and what innovations that are on the horizon could be thought of as good test cases for our own thinking. Almost every country has a scientific community, a commission of some sort, operating to support government activities. But in this case, as we move on to from a very skeletal framework with some principles, etc., to filling it and articulating and developing consensus around core operation principles, it is imperative to have with us, or have as part of the initiative, is a scientific commission, call it whatever one wishes. Ultimately, we'll have to demonstrate a proof of concept. If we have a concept, it makes sense, etc. All right, what's the test for it? How do we know that we're on the right track or not on the right track? And at this point, I'm out of my depth here, but I would say that if we bring this question from the global question level down to the very, very, very local and no more local than a city, then it's also very useful to keep an eye and to learn from the AIWS city initiative that is going on now. Et voila, that's about all I have to say, and I thank you for your patience. Done.
Thank you, Nasli, so much, and thanks for all of your good work on this. Well, that gives us a basis for a good, lively discussion, and we've asked a couple of people to address this problem from their particular perspective, and then we'll open things up for a full discussion between now and 10:30. So let's begin, Magnus, with you, Magnus Magnusson from the UNESCO, and you're on. Where are you?
Thank you, dear Governor.
Right. Okay.
It's a real pleasure to be on the call. Thank you for the organizers and excellencies. I am representing UNESCO and Ms. Gabriela Ramos, who is our Assistant Director General for the Social Human Sciences, who cannot be with us here today for a very important reason. And that reason is, in fact, that as we speak this week, 193 member states and their representatives are negotiating a text which will be the first ethical normative instrument on artificial intelligence. This instrument has been under preparation for over a year in consultation with experts. It's been drafted by experts, but then also it has been vetted by local communities, by civic society, private sector representatives, scientific institutions and think tanks, all in all 50,000 contributions and comments to the text that have been collected and integrated into a revised draft document, which is then today being negotiated with among member states of UNESCO, and in total we have 193 member states. This is an ethical instrument, which in UNESCO's language is a recommendation, which means this is the second highest level of legally binding international instrument that UNESCO has at its disposal. The highest would be a convention, like the Convention Against Doping in Sports, for example, which is also UNESCO, or of course all the cultural conventions that you probably are familiar with. A convention becomes becomes local national law, whereas a recommendation is not binding, but there is a reporting structure on it, which allows us also to support member states who are not feeling that they have the capacity to implement what they signed up for. So linked to the recommendation, if approved by member states during the governing conference in November, will be a global program with several regional, sub-regional and national intervention logics that will support member states in understanding their risks and their opportunities related to artificial intelligence. There will be an ethical impact assessment done and a readiness assessment and index regarding artificial intelligence in the local context. So this will be the programmatic support UNESCO will provide to member states who request us to support them. Now, just specifically as the as Ms. Kukri just mentioned, sorry if I expelled your name wrong, pronounced your name wrong. This is specifically an ethical instrument. So what does that mean? Well, ethics as a dynamic basis for the normative evaluation and guidance of AI technologies, referring to human dignity, well-being, and the prevention of harm as a compass and rooted in the ethics of science and technology. And UNESCO is the UN lead on the ethics of science and technology and also on bioethics. So we work on many dimensions, including some very practical ones like the access of refugees to healthcare, or some of the spearheading technologies like genome engineering. Another very, very important issue, by the way, of course, that needs to be really tackled internationally. Of course, AI technologies are always evolving, so inclusive and pluralistic ethical reflections is really constantly required. And ethics as a dynamic process does not refer to a change in values, but to adapt existing frameworks as required ensures that values are always respected. Also, ethical frameworks are designed to provide a response in cases where regulation does not or cannot exist. And an example of this, which is very current and important for us in this unprecedented situation we're in for this generation, namely the pandemic, is that it's from the start, it was quite hard for many countries to know how to tackle the pandemic in terms of either a political or policy or regulatory approach versus a hands-off scientific approach to let the scientists speak. I'm Swedish. In my own country, we took the latter approach, where the scientists were given the center stage. The problem was that there was no science related to this virus. Mm-hmm. So what do you do? And this is really what created a lot of confusion and pain, because there was very little guidance that could actually be provided. And there was a guessing game, which was very much related to maintaining the credibility of the authorities versus actually changing your story as science came along. So the ethical perspectives could have been an alternative to approach this situation, which in fact also UNESCO with other international and regional organizations did tackle by issuing statements that were presented on national level in the appropriate fora, but maybe not as much listened to in terms of what do you do when you don't have the science and when politics really can't do much either. What do you do? And of course, it comes back to the do no harm, to the dimension of making sure you understand the most vulnerable populations and really go into depth in understanding their situation and vulnerability specifically, which some countries did and others did not do as well. Much has been said about the dimensions on cultural diversity. Obviously, this is one of UNESCO's core areas of work. So let me just give you a few examples of how not cultural diverse the current internet is, and therefore a lot of the AI technology is currently not either. As you know, much of AI technology is geographically concentrated in the hands of a few private tech companies. In fact, according to MIT, the world's 13 most important AI firms are based in the US, China, Japan, and Europe. None in the rest of the world. Those companies are located in the richest countries such as the US, China, and Japan. These countries account for most AI peer-reviewed publications and patent applications according to the OECD AI Policy Observatory. According to the Stanford HAI AI Index 2021 report, South America, Africa, Arab states, Southeast Asia, to name only a few geographic areas, are lagging behind in major ways. Furthermore, professionals, academics, and experts in the field of AI are overwhelmingly men-based in North America, China, Japan, or Europe, leading to well-recorded gender and ethnic cultural biases when it comes to AI technologies, not necessarily intentional. Diversity is key to preventing any kind of bias, and we cannot neglect it. All voices count, and if we disregard diversity, it would lead to a major data bias in the data sets, and this is commonly understood and known today that the data sets and the quality of the data sets needs to be one of the first dimensions we look at. And significant technology and social issues in the future could otherwise be coming our way that we would need to deal with. Now, if we look at languages and dialects in the world, we can count nearly 7,000 different ones, yet only 7% are reflected in published online material. Swahili, for example, is not supported by large platforms. Arabic, although the fourth most spoken language, only accounts for 1 to 3% of the online content. AI-powered voice assistants only work in 8 languages. 50% of the web pages are written in English, and 75% of the web's top-level domains come from Europe and North America. So there are real issues regarding lack of diversity in internet content, which very quickly would translate, if it's not addressed, to AI algorithms and other applications. So as an organization whose missions encompasses science, culture, and education, UNESCO is strategically and uniquely placed to address the full spectrum of issues around AI. So taking into consideration the multiplicity of approaches to technology found in different cultures is a prerequisite to addressing these issues. And diversity must be integrated in every single step of the AI lifecycle, from creation of algorithms to the collection of data, down to the numerous applications of AI in every aspect of today's society, healthcare, for example, education, transportation, and so forth. And this is the only way to ensure all voices will contribute to the development of ethics, tools, policies, and frameworks for AI. So these are the dimensions that the UNESCO normative instrument are addressing. In particular, in fact, they're addressing dimensions that link very much to the dimensions I mentioned, but also it stands out as a text that brings the environmental and climate dimensions into the picture linked to AI technology, and also heavily addresses the gender equality dimensions and minority dimensions when it comes to AI applications. So with those words, I again just want to thank you for the opportunity and congratulate you on your initiative. And I noticed the call to the UN to act. This is UNESCO's contribution to that call. We hope this will be a useful instrument. We don't pretend it's easy to negotiate it. There is not consensus on everything, but we are in the middle of that negotiation this week. So by the end of the week, we'll know more. And the process going forward will lead to a decision by 193 member states, as I mentioned, in November. And hopefully that will then lead to the first global ethical normative instrument on artificial intelligence. Thank you very much again.
Great, terrific, terrific. Okay, let's now turn for a final comment. Sorry. Let's turn for a final comment from Paul Nemitz, and then we'll have a general discussion. So Paul, you're on. Are you unmuted? Hello.
Thank you,
Oh,
thank you,
yeah.
Michael.
Okay.
And congratulations, Stavros. It's a great day for the European Union. You receiving this award today, and great work on the table in terms of the draft accord. Let me give a few words of introduction of possible thinking on such an accord. First, because AI is predicted to be pervasive in all areas of society as a useful tool, whether in the environment, education, health, security, and so on, one may be tempted to rewrite all the rules for society in such an accord. And that, of course, then leads to the necessary tolerance and relativism, which we find in very broad international agreements. And that would be the classic approach to respect all the diversities of countries, of views on how things should be going in this form of democracy or that form of democracy. Now, I would say we have an alternative in relation to AI due to the technical nature of the subject we are dealing with. What do I mean by this? The technical nature of the subject opens up parameters and categories on which I believe agreement is possible, very independent of the question of whether the signatory is a democracy or not, and whether a signatory has this or that security or economic interest or this or that fundamental right in place or not. So I think we should be first searching for those principles which will be useful to all in the world if we can get binding rules on this. And I will give you some examples on this. For example, because of the technical nature, because of the machine nature of AI, we want to be certain in the future that an AI system really does what it is supposed to do. And I would say that is one of those generic principles, which is on a sufficient high level of abstraction that everybody in this world could read. Or let me give another data. It should come reliable, so it should which is unbiased. Again, this is a principle on which I would think, I would like to hear those who say, well, but we have to have tolerance for those who may see this differently. So what I would encourage us to do in our ongoing work is to search together for those generic principles which are actually defining what is new in this international accord, rather than trying to rewrite all the general principles ranging from the balance between security and fundamental rights right through to sustainability in environmental affairs of all policy areas and of all world accords which may have existed in history. I think we should focus on the new challenge and the new specificities. And my prediction is, if we do this, we will find principles on which agreement in a binding form is maybe more likely than on those agreements on which mankind has only in very rare, lucky occasions found the possibility to agree on binding rules. That would be my first remark. My second remark is relating to the reason why one would want to have such an agreement. Now, first, let me say that in contrast to the speaker I've just heard, in the European Union, of course, we have moved on. There was really a development of thinking, moving from first the thinking that the law is not, and binding rules are not amenable to be used for regulating such a technology. And this was the thinking which led the Commission to set up a high-level group on AI ethics. Also, the German government set up a high-level group on data ethics. And, all in all, we have around 80 ethics codes around the world today on AI. And I don't want to speculate on, who has put the money on this orientation on ethics rather than the law, and, for whom it was good and for whom it maybe wasn't. But one thing is clear, that in the European Union, the thinking has moved on from the conviction that ethics will be at the center as a tool. Of course, in terms of substantive principles, we want to act ethically, but the Union has moved on to start work on binding rules which are enforceable against everyone. And this is significant. Why is this significant? Because in contrast to some of the other speakers, we do believe that AI is so important in terms of its ubiquity, but also in terms of the power it gives to the state and to private parties, that we cannot only work with incentives, non-binding rules, and let's say all the instruments which we know from the OECD. So we already have an OECD code on AI principles to which many countries have agreed. We now have the work ongoing in UNESCO. We have work ongoing on some kind of global instrument in the Council of Europe, which is the broader European organization to which Russia and Turkey belong, and to the conventions of which the United States has also signed up on occasion. And you mentioned in your agreement, in a draft agreement, you mentioned the Budapest Convention. I would say we should be ambitious in our work and see in terms of what we aim for. We see that we aim for a binding international agreement of the type of the law of the sea, which contains important elements of a binding nature, and which includes also the instruments and institutions which are necessary to deal with binding rules and to make sure that binding rules are respected. Is it right, and this will be my last and third remark, is it right to take the multilateral agreement on the law of the sea, which is a United Nations agreement, as a model for our work on AI? The multilateral agreement on the law of the sea is the biggest binding convention of the United Nations. And I would say, having in mind the comments which we heard from our first speaker, namely the ambition to have as many countries on board as possible as a precondition for such an accord working, I think that makes the law of the sea a great model. Second, the law of the sea at the time was extremely innovative in dealing with a space which was largely unexplored out there beyond the site from the coast, 70% of the space of the world. And this was exactly the reason that states got together and agreed on, if you look at them today, amazing principles of a binding nature, because everybody understood that this new frontier, the ocean being at the beginning of exploitation, deep sea mining, and so on, needs common rules to avoid conflict in the future. And the United Nations and states went very far in this, even set up a court and a dispute settlement system, which today works fairly well. So I think we should have our ambitions high. We should go beyond just repeating non-binding types of principles, which we already find in the OECD code and in many ethics codes. We should focus on the specific nature of the technology, which provides us with the opportunity to set out principles on which agreement is possible. And we should aim for binding rules, because we are dealing with power relations here, power relations between states and private corporations. Let's not forget that those corporations which are at the forefront of operationalizing AI in terms of financial capacity are bigger than many states of this world. So I can imagine that many states actually have an interest in binding rules for this reason alone. And we're dealing with power relations between the states and individuals, not only individuals of the own country, and power relations between corporations which use AI and people. And since these power relations are one of the key reasons why we are dealing in a binding way with AI in legislation in the European Union, this would be my encouragement to our work, that we recognize that this element of managing power from technology and controlling power is one of the key challenges of the future, and underlies our willingness to come together in this group and look for global principles which help us to give a frame to this new power over people, over states, over resources, over security. To close, I commend to everyone the new report from Bruce Schneier at the Belfer Center at Harvard University, came out this week, on AI as a hacking tool in the future. And he describes a world in which all binding principle, all decency, all systems of security which we may have in technical devices will be systematically undermined by AI systems which have been built for this purpose. So I do not believe that we need an agreement which becomes a marketing tool for AI. I do believe we underestimate the risks. And I do believe here we have another principle which we will find agreement on by many, namely that AI, which has this purpose as described by Bruce Schneier, should be outruled, namely AI which serves as a tool for criminal purpose. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Okay, we've got lots to think about here, and we've got about what 30 minutes anyway to have some general discussion. So let's begin with that, and the floor is open. Who wants to begin?
I think Professor David Silberway, he would like to raise
Okay.
that first. Professor David Silberway. David.
Hi, thank you, Tuan. Thank you, Governor, and thank you to our esteemed speakers. I really appreciate all the comments that were made by everyone today, and the last ones by Mr. Nemitz really resonated. I'm a neurologist and a psychiatrist, a behavioral neuroscientist, and with what's going on in the world today, and if one looks historically or indeed evolutionarily at our brains, we're really talking about AI as a product of the human brain that now, together with increased knowledge in psychology and the sort of power dynamics that were just mentioned, can literally hack our brains, in addition to hacking into systems. And so it's this sort of direct bi-directional influence, and making sure that it is for good and not for ill, and keeping in mind that, as was said, it's really important to get as many people in the tent as possible, but there will always be states and bad actors outside of the tent who can do enormous harm, way out of proportion because of these technologies to what was previously the case. And so having robust mechanisms for addressing that, and I think the sort of law of the sea, as we just heard about, and these sort of universal enforceable approaches are going to be really, really necessary, especially when you're dealing with authoritarian states, independent bad actors, profit-driven companies whose incentives and self-justifications will not permit their engagement constructively, and one wants to be equitable and realize that one needs to understand cross-cultural features and be incredibly respectful of different cultures and systems, but it does come down to sort of fundamental human rights, which themselves these days are being debated in certain spheres. And I think these are larger issues that need to continue to be promulgated. Let me just also say that two areas in addition where there may be some concern, in addition to the sort of hacking, automated hacking that we just heard about, are brain-computer interface, which I think is coming. We are already using it in neurosurgery for good, but like any technology, and the more we understand with the sort of work that we and others do with brain imaging, the neural circuits basis for human behaviors and decisions and actions and emotions and perceptions, and the more people seek enhancement, not just cure of disease, and dare I say it, the more people seek control and power, then I think we need to be concerned about direct and indirect mechanisms of sort of neural AI interface that are going to be coming faster than can be regulated, and where ethics need to be in place. And finally, AI weapons, which already are making their way onto the world stage, where large-scale drones or series of attacks or defenses are automated at speeds of milliseconds, and are played out beyond direct human, once a button is pressed, if you will, direction, and with algorithms that themselves can be opaque or concerning, or certainly have big implications, and things can spiral out of control or scale in ways that the consequences of which have not fully been considered, although I'm sure in certain military think tanks they have been. So these are some of the points, some of the areas that I just wanted to highlight, and I really wanted to say that the words of the ambassador, the words of Nasli, and that we heard from Mr. Nemitz, also Ambassador Raglan, I think really create a wonderful synergistic dialogue that hopefully can be followed up with coordinated action.
Well said. Well said. Ambassador Stavros, any thoughts from you as you've been listening to the discussion?
I think, Mike, I think it's fascinating. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to listen in. I particularly focused on the notion that was outlined on how do we get the biggest possible coalition of countries in this, because this is certainly our own desire as well. I commend UNESCO for its work, and I think that whatever we do here should work in parallel with those initiatives, because UNESCO, in fact, gives us the opportunity to reach to places like Latin America, like Africa, like Asia, in a much more effective way to bring people in. But at the same time, I do note, and I know that from my work on human rights as well for many years for the European Union, that there are out there countries and leaders that are simply committed violators of rights. They come from that perspective. And so at the same time, they're very big players. So how do you get them engaged? And what do you do, frankly, with the big number of countries that we tend to ignore in these discussions? Those who sit on the fence, the gray area countries. So we often talk about working with like-mindeds who are just like us, big democracies who support human rights. And that is indispensable. You cannot do it otherwise, which is why we are so intent on working very closely with the United States on this topic. We often talk about how do we counter the committed violators and those who want to use AI simply because they it fits in an ideological perspective of control. But the question really is, what do you do with all these countries that sit on the fence? They may not be great democracies. They may, in fact, be sliding back in some instances, but they do have an instinct that they want to do right things. If they're approached in the correct way, and if they're brought into a bigger tent, as opposed to feel that they're being lectured to either by the authoritarians or by the Democrats. And that was a challenge we had in human rights. So let me very quickly then, just to close this intervention, say a bit from my experience again from human rights. When it comes to a country like China, I visited China 3 times officially as EU Special Representative for Human Rights, and there were 3 very tough visits. They gave me a lot of access to different things, including in Tibet. Of course, it was a very controlled visit, but I managed to raise all the tough issues, to manage to talk to many people, including civil society, including internet activists in China, who were describing all the problems they were facing at that time. We're talking about 13, 14, 15. But I also asked in one of my visits to go visit Huawei and ZTE. And it was a big consternation back at the foreign ministry in China. Should we let this guy go or should we not let him go? How should this work? And eventually they said, okay, go. And I went to them, and I went first to Huawei, and I was greeted by the public relations person they had there, and she immediately took me to an exhibition room where I could see all the new watches and all the new phones that Huawei had, and she started telling me about all these wonderful new things. And I said, maybe you misunderstood. I'm not a technology guy. I'm the human rights guy. I'd like to talk to you about how it is that you use your technologies. How do you build privacy or don't build privacy in your phones? How do you deal at the time with the new Chinese government law about providing backdoors to which became law? I mean, that time was a draft, providing backdoors to all these security windows that the company had to be able to access information whenever the government wanted to. And they got into a big hullabaloo on how to deal with that. And eventually they brought down, a couple of the high-level people for privacy and all this stuff. And we had a discussion. I told them this at the time. I said, what are you going to do with this law? Do you like it? Because I said, the fact of the matter is you're trying to be an international company. You're trying to be out there selling phones to everyone around the world. And frankly, the moment that the world knows that those phones can be at any moment accessed by the Chinese government, you will not be selling any phones anymore. And so I'm not appealing to any sense of ethics or any sense of politics or democracy. I'm asking you as business people, because presumably that's what you do, whether or not you get it, that this is a major risk. And one of them, in the presence of foreign ministry officials, told me at the time, you know what, we've written a letter to the government in which we say that we disagree with this law, which I found quite interesting. I haven't seen the letter. I don't know how hard they fought against it. The fact of the matter is, you come a few years later with that law passed, and Huawei is in deep trouble as a company around the world, because it is very, very clearly perceived in the US and in Europe and elsewhere as a real threat to have 5G technology from a company that is so deeply embedded with the government that without any checks and balances wants to be able to have access. Is it possible to get people in China to listen to the arguments here that we have, whether it is an agreement on principles? And I fully agree. I think that an AI accord would be most successful if it is able to, to identify one or two priority issues that we can all agree around, as opposed to get into a big, again, sort of a broad discussion on everything. Okay? And also, if we are able to raise the bar when it comes to some fundamental things, such as social scoring or such as mass biometric use in public spaces, that we can all agree that no matter what else the AI promises or challenges, that those things are not okay. Maybe it's more possible to get in a coalition there, and that's where I come. Then, okay, so China and a couple of other countries, maybe there are arguments and power players in those structures, in those societies, that can be approached with, that do not rely on what we would, as democracies, say values, but might be able to be persuasive, because assuming that the system can be influenced through an internal discussion that doesn't necessarily involve us. But what do we do with those gray area countries? In human rights, we implemented as European Union in my last years in that job a world initiative that we called Good Human Rights Stories Initiative. We determined that the best way to approach countries sitting on the fence and to make sure that they fall on our side as opposed to on the other side was to, in fact, celebrate their ownership of human rights, as weak as it might have been, but probably strong in some areas. Bring them in and give them sort of an empowerment, a sense of pride in promoting human rights in difficult circumstances. Make them part of the team. And, that worked fantastically well. Now, some of these countries, not the majority, some of them have slid back in human rights and democracy in the past few years, and none of them have not. Can we in AI think of a similar strategy, creating a good artificial intelligence stories strategy, where we actually do find countries and governments that, in spite of other difficulties, are understanding the challenges of AI, do not want to be subjected to, do not themselves want to become sort of, the playing ground of big companies to be trying out all the, the new AI technologies. They themselves want to put some limits. We would make a coalition much stronger if we do that. And that's where UNESCO, us ourselves with smart planning, the OECD, others may come into play. So yeah, these are just some, if you like, more strategic political thoughts on how we build this. Not so much on the substance as on the strategy. I should say over and out.
Yes. Mike,
yep.
Please. Yes, maybe we invite Alan Citrin to.
Alan, where are you?
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yep.
All
You're
right.
on.
First of all, I want to thank you all very much, and especially the ambassador. It was fortunate the announcement about the proposals came out in the last 24 hours. So I've had a chance to read some of the articles on it. Some range from hysteria that had no facts, just judgments. And the articles that had facts about what the proposals are saying, I thought were very thoughtful, very practical, great goals, and congratulations and best wishes. What I'd like to add, typically you mentioned Huawei and the economic impact. And I'd like to add or ask about another dimension that perhaps can be pursued in the EU, which is EU AI champions, businesses. As we look at this, the economic champions for many generations lately have been American and Chinese firms. We do see a tremendous move towards ESG investing, ESG product purchasing. Consumers are aware and vote with their dollars. It would seem that one additional lever that the EU could look at would be to develop EU AI champions that would be economically successful and that can draw and attract business in part by the virtue of their abiding by these protocols. Is this something that is being pursued, considered, investigated, studied, or it's, we'll let the market do what it does and we'll see what happens?
What about that? What about that, folks?
Well,
Paul or Peter?
Yeah. I will quickly answer this. The regulation is only part of a package. And the package includes industrial policy measures to increase the uptake of AI, to increase research, and we are spending billions from public budgets on AI research, both fundamental research and also research close to the market. So definitely, we have a strategy which has 3 pillars. First, the industrial policy and research pillar, as you say, making European AI competitive. And I think we are quite successful, in innovation. Really, we have just seen it in COVID. Europe is the pharmacy of this world. We don't have to go on innovation issues with our heads down. But we have very innovative AI companies also in Europe. Second pillar is getting our people ready, qualification, and also retraining for those who may lose their jobs or not being sufficiently qualified to take up jobs related to AI. And part 3 is rights, and this is where part of this regulation falls. But if you go through the regulation, you will see it also contains measures to enable better AI, like regulatory sandboxes, which make it possible for companies to try out concepts. So I think we have, this is one of the best prepared initiatives I have seen ever in the European Commission. I think we have a good mix of industrial policy, strategy, qualification of people, and regulation for democracy, fundamental rights, and the rule of law.
Thank you. I'm really encouraged because if I look at GDPR as an example, you've done a better job of regulating American firms than America has done. And so I look forward to your leadership on this.
Governor.
Yes.
Thank you, Nasli.
Well, the good news is, I don't know how Stavros has perceived it, but what I have seen of statements from the US government about this proposal, it was very positive so far. We have seen some tweets of the colleagues in the Department of Commerce and so on, and it's all very positive. It's a very different tone to how a GDPR draft was received at the time. It's much more constructive. And my feeling is that many in the US will support our efforts, and we will be in a very constructive finding process. What are the best rules?
Well, that's
encouraging.
Let me just jump in very quickly. Jake Sullivan tweeted a couple of days ago when a proposal came out that the US found that to be a very constructive step, and they're looking forward to working with the EU. On Alan's point, companies and recognizing AI champions, I think is a very interesting proposal. And I can tell you from the GDPR perspective, privacy perspective, that It is in fact companies themselves, the big ones, who understood at some point that selling themselves as privacy champions was the business model of the future. Whereas at the beginning, they were very resistant and reluctant to adopt any real privacy constraints suggested by the EU at the time. When I was having those discussions back in the 2008, 2007, 2009, initially the big companies were telling me to just bug off. And eventually they started competing with each other. Initially, I remember that it was data retention periods. So we were making a big deal in the EU about how long you could actually keep data that you collect, let's say, on social media and stuff like that, right? And initially the companies had basically an unlimited time to keep them, or 1 or 2 years. And suddenly there started to be a competition of who's going to be keeping the data for a less amount of time. And the moment this happened, the moment that we understood that our proposals were becoming a business model, a competitive advantage kind of model for companies, I knew we were on the right track. So being able to celebrate companies who are moving on AI, on a human-centric, trustworthy path on AI, I think is a great idea.
Good.
Thank you.
Encouraging.
Magnus, UNESCO want to say something.
Thank you. Yes, no, great question. And we're actually working with a group called LightNet Foundation in Sweden that is linking to ISO standards and developing reporting standards on AI, kind of along the lines of the ESG reporting, using some of UNESCO's indicators, but also from other sources. And Tetra Pak right now, and I understand Ericsson have signed up to actually start reporting along around 80 different indicators publicly, how they develop AI and how they apply AI innovations. So I think that there is movement here, probably similar movements other places in the world, but this is just one example. Fully in agreement, very important. Just kind of, since I have the floor, just kind of a reflection on what was said in terms of moving in different paces. I think we have to move in different paces. I think like-minded groups and countries can definitely and should move forward on binding agreements and legislation. Of course, that's the way it's always worked. The UN's role is very specific. We have to work on consensus basis, one voice, one country. This is our place in the international collaboration, our specific role. So for us, we'll normally move slowly or slower, but in some cases, in fact, we didn't, like on the human rights dimensions. But today, the realities are different than they were only 20 years ago in terms of member states' sentiments and how active they are in international fora. It's just true. It's a reality. I have a long UN history, and it's definitely changed with the G77 group in China and India leading, in different ways and moving forward with issues and dimensions together, which is a very strong force. And I think that's a overall important and perhaps even progressive way, because we need to have the world along and change into an international collaborative kind of a culture. And I think Ambassador Lambrinidis had a really good point about how to engage in a diplomatically smart way with member states who maybe haven't discovered yet the benefits of human rights fully. Great example that he brought up as well, how that can have commercial dimensions, but also other dimensions that link actually to well-being and growth. So, I think we have to be smart. We have to work along different trajectories, different speeds. The UNESCO recommendation, we hope one day it will be a convention like the Convention of the Sea, even though the Convention of the Sea has only 160 or so member states, 167 among the 200 plus members. So it's not the biggest in that sense, but it certainly has been very successful. And of course, all of us, I think, in this community need to stay sharp and really understand the seriousness. I think we all are understanding that this is a challenge that really requires very ambitious approaches, regulatory, self-regulatory as well. And I think everybody looks to some of the leaders in terms of regulation in the world for guidance and maybe how to start this. So I think, and maybe just a final point, I think somebody also said we can't talk generally about AI continuously. We have to deep dive into specific AI applications that address specific sectors like health and other dimensions to really uncover the specifics around rights in that application specifically. That's a lot of specifics, but I think that's where we need to go as well. Thank you.
Good. Nasli.
Thank you.
Governor, we would like to invite Mark Rutenberg.
Hold on a second. Let me just ask Nasli if she has any.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I do, Tuan.
Yeah.
First, I would like to thank, of course, everybody. But I think the last half hour or so was very, very instructive, because what I get out of it is the need to recognize that at one level of detail on commercial and operational levels, the ISO model will weigh in. There's no doubt about it. And so Mr. Nemitz's concern about accords or agreements on detailed micro methodological elements of AI, yes, but I doubt very much that we can start a global process at that level. I agree that it is necessary and it is essential. And we turn to this when we talk about the International Scientific Community Committee on helping us with the AI logistics. On the law of the seas, it's been a while since I familiarized myself with that body of literature, but I just would like to remind you that we know for a fact, according to the US government, 98% of all internet traffic goes through undersea cables. So the law of the sea, of course, somehow matters. I'm not sure how it matters there. I discount the 98 and let's say 95 and the like. But the point I'd like to conclude with is that the dilemma with the AI, or the challenge with the AI, as opposed to the law of the seas or other aggregate issues, is that we will be dealing with individuals, not always within in agreement with their own national government. So we have to think about both national policy and individual behavior. If we take MIT students just as an example, it's frightening how smart those kids are, and it's amazing how their own rate of innovation in AI is at this point. So we have to keep that rates of change thing into account. Thank you.
Great. Okay, who's next? Tuan, you mentioned.
I think we should invite Mark Rutenberg. Yeah.
Okay. Mark, where are you?
Mark, please.
Mark, you out there? Yeah, there you are.
There we are. Hi.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Tuan. Thank you, Governor, and congratulations, Stavros, on this wonderful award. And also thank you to Nasli for this very good proposal. It did occur to me as I was thinking about this accord and all of the work that's currently underway at UNESCO and the Council of Europe and the European Commission, and of course we have the OECD principles and the G20 guidelines. Stavros's point about being strategic and perhaps looking for high priority issues in the AI realm could in the moment have the greatest impact. It's certainly true in the history of AI policy that the initial concern that was raised among the computer scientists was actually autonomous weapon systems. I remember this from more than 30 years ago, when computer scientists raised concerns about lethal autonomous weapon systems, and that has actually led to a very important international initiative to ensure that there's always a human in the loop. Some governments feel strongly that now is the time to establish an accord. Other governments, have been less enthusiastic. So this is one opportunity. The others that Stavros mentioned also concern social scoring, which I see as a clear dividing line between democratic governments and authoritarian governments. It is the question of, do we evaluate our leaders or do our leaders evaluate us? That is reflected in the decision to deploy an AI system to rate citizens. And then finally, on the use of facial recognition, which is a very useful tool to open your iPhone, but when used as a technique for mass surveillance will most certainly chill dissent and weaken democratic structures. So at least in this moment, those would seem to be very good opportunities for an international accord.
Who else would like to? We've got a few minutes left before we have to wrap up. Any additional thoughts on this?
Yes.
Perhaps
Yes.
can I leap in here?
Go ahead.
I just like to express my appreciation, certainly for for the event and the different voices we've heard, in that it's suggesting a much greater sense of commonality of view, of aspiring to a global solution than I've experienced up to now. And I've been concerned a bit over the last couple of years with the initiatives that have either been sectoral or regional, such as the EU, as to whether people were seeing these initiatives as ends in themselves, or whether they were seeing them as steps along a road towards a global solution. And various people, I think, have touched on the fact that I think AI crucially does require a global governance system, and that so many aspects of it are truly global in their nature. And therefore, I've been very encouraged to hear from the ambassador and from various speakers of that global focus. And similarly, the AIIA is aimed at that global remit. But there was a key question about whether the desire to support democracy was going to trump the desire to have global governance for AI. And I think generally what's been coming across is very much that people are desiring to be inclusive, to have the people with whom we may disagree on human rights or on democracy, have them in the tent, and to see how far we can reach agreement with them, in that it's much better to have them inside the tent than outside. But I have, before today, I was been wrestling with the fact that the chairman of the EU high-level expert group, he has expressed the view that the problem is that human rights is at the core of a lot of the AI legislation and required legislation, and human rights is where the big difference is with authoritarian regimes. And so I've been particularly encouraged by the two elements from Paul Nemitz, his very interesting suggestion, which I'll follow up and see whether there are other principles along those lines. And similarly, the ambassador's suggestions about ways of bringing people in on human rights. So I find today extremely encouraging. Thank you.
Good. Maybe one additional comment before we wrap up. Any of you who haven't yet participated?
Governor, if I may go.
Go ahead.
Mary here. I just want to follow up on Ambassador's comments on the countries that are sitting on the fence. It is very close to what you would do like the approach is very close to what you would do in a business sense, in a gap analysis. If you have areas that are close to your goal, very close to your goal, you don't worry too much. If there are areas that are too far away from your goal, you don't focus your resources too much on those either. It's those gray areas and the ones that you have the potential to change that the initial focus would be in. We see that those countries that are on the fence, also some of the global South countries, are also the countries that are under China's sphere of influence, whether that is investments in their governmental infrastructure, or whether that is covered under the Belt and Road initiatives, or whether that is covered under the standards, technological and AI system standards that China is pushing in terms of standardization of hardware as well as software. So looking at what Ambassador mentioned around narrower applications, and can we use any narrower applications to pull those countries on the fence, the gray countries, towards an international accord, whether that is, to Mark's point, social scoring or facial recognition on mass surveillance, or whether that is on children's, like a convention, an AI convention to start with, and get it from expand the coverage from those narrow areas would be my is where I stand. I think we're also looking at that power structure between corporations and governments, and how the corporations are embedding themselves in the governmental systems. How can we coordinate? How can we avoid that, or control that, or monitor that is also very crucial as we're moving forward.
Okay, sounds good. I think we're getting close to the end of our time. Let me just say thanks to all of you for being a part of this. Special congratulations to our honoree. Tuan, thank you for your great work and putting all of this together. And I think we've got a basis on which to move ahead and do some very good things. Tuan, maybe a last word or two from you before we wrap up.
Thank you so much, Governor Michael Dukakis. Thank you so much, Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis. And once again, warmly congratulations for your achievement and honor. And thank you all our participants and speakers, panelists today. Great ideas, great concept and discussion. And we will prepare for next event. And I hope all of us will join with 3 days conference between Boston Global Forum and World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid. We will continue to discuss about AI International Accord with new version, with upgrade from our discussion today, and from our partners, our friends from EU, from Japan, from India, and from many countries, and from university institutions and think tanks and business leaders, political leaders. So we hope we will have a wonderful event from June 22 to 24 this year. And we will connect with you and invite you to join and work with us to prepare, and you will become speakers and panelists and participants and event. Thank you so much. And also thank again with Governor Michael Dukakis, your ideas, your call, the world need AI International Accord now happen. We are start to have first version for this accord, and we very honored and glad to see the world now discuss, European and also the US prepare for that agreement, and EU work, wonderful work. Yes, thank you so much.
Great, Tuan. Thank you. Thank you all very, very much. Mr. Ambassador, thank you. And we look forward to working with you and look forward to those June dates with you. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Congratulations.